And this was in the early 1760s. And he said, I think it was February 1761, John Adams said of that court case, he said it was on this day that independence was born.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution. Walk in the footsteps of heroes and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are with Cam Molineux. I hope I got that right, Cam. Cam Molineux.
Real close.
Author of The Spirit of a Revolution and The Mind of a Revolution, 2 books that she's put out. And she's excited to share with us. And quite frankly, the reviews on these books look really good. So congratulations to you, Cam. The author process, the writing process is a bear. It's not for everyone to be able to take your thoughts and your research and put it into a form that people are educated and entertained with. And that's a tough job, and it takes a talent, and you obviously have that talent. So tell us a little bit about how you got into this, and tell us a little bit about the books.
Okay, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I've been excited about this. This is great to be able to be here and share. I'll start with how I got into it. First, about 12 or 13 years ago, well, probably more like 15 years ago, my husband and I had a growing concern for our country. And it wasn't tied to a particular administration or anything. We were just learning a lot of information about America's history, recent history, that concerned us. And so that was kind of part one. And then part two was, and you probably won't believe this because you've met me and you know I'm this petite Southern belle, but I used to be a licensed residential builder and had my own construction company. And how that ties in is with the collapse of the housing industry in 2008, all of a sudden I had tons of time on my hands. And so I spent lots of time at the state archives studying my family tree. And in August of that year, last day of family vacation, I woke up at 4:00 in the morning and realized that I had a book to write and that I could use people in my family tree who had a significant role to play, which I didn't realize, before doing the research. But I could use their stories to help people understand what our founding fathers believe was worth fighting for. And so that's what I spent more than 12 years doing. At the time I thought, a year or two, I'll knock it out. And it ended up being 13 years now ago that I started this journey. And as far as the books themselves, The Spirit of the Revolution, the main character is William Molineux, who I tried to prove was not in my family tree because he was a little crazy. We all have those people in our family trees. And William Molineux was certainly one of those. He was the oldest participant of the Boston Tea Party. And he was John Hancock's next door neighbor and Samuel Adams' right-hand man. He was a rabble rouser, and he was more radical than the radicals. He stood up in one town meeting and proposed something, and people said, that would be treasonous. And his response was basically, so what's the problem? So he didn't really care what people thought. He just wanted to do what was right. And sometimes it was more radical than the radicals. And the second novel, and so The Spirit, so Boston. My husband and I don't have kids. I tell people God has a sense of humor. We don't have kids, and I only went through history class one time. When you have kids, you go through history class more than once. And I just went through it one time, and I had no clue as to how crazy Boston was. But it really was a crazy place, tar and feathers and that kind of a thing. And it was interesting to study. The second novel, The Mind of a Revolution, it took me 8 years for the first one and 4 for the second. The Mind of a Revolution is about Edmund Pendleton. And he was basically William Molineux's polar opposite. He was a statesman. He was an attorney. He was friends with George Washington. He was a quiet leader. He was definitely a leader in Virginia, and he had a significant role to play in the Declaration of Independence, although it took him a long time to get there. And my story has Edmund Pendleton as the main character. Patrick Henry is my antagonist. And most people are kind of surprised by that. But my story is about how Edmund Pendleton eventually came around. Most people were not for independence in 1774, and we forget that. Hindsight is 2020. And we forget that there were a lot of struggles that people had to go through in order to figure out, what, is it time to declare our independence? And Edmund Pendleton was one of those, but he eventually came around, and he had a significant role to play in our declaring our independence. You'll see his portrait in libraries and courthouses and that kind of thing in Virginia. And I have a picture in front of my computer, one of two portraits made of George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Edmund Pendleton on their way to the First Continental Congress together as they left Mount Vernon. So when I first heard about that, I thought, no, that can't be true. Well, when I read it in George Washington's diary, I decided it probably was true that they went to Philadelphia together for the First Continental Congress.
So if you were to put yourself back in that time, you having these polar opposite ancestors, where would you fall in line with that?
Well, when I first started reading about Edmund Pendleton and it talked about him being a conservative, I said, wait a minute, I'm confused. I'm a conservative and I would have been for independence. Well, I eventually had to realize, no, back then conservative was, we're not rushing off to war. And so I could relate to Edmund Pendleton's personality a lot more than I could to William Molineux. It took me a long time to figure out William Molineux's personality because he was just kind of all over the place. And so when I started this journey, I would have said I would have been for independence. But then when I realized the struggles that real people had to go through, I decided, you know what? I would have really been struggling. I mean, I'm very loyal. And I was just reading this morning that the word loyalist, that wasn't used early on. Patriot was, but loyalist wasn't. And I think that my personality is such, I would have been loyal to the homeland. I mean, it's like being loyal to your parent. But there were so many different things that happened along the way that it became obvious that it was finally time to declare our independence.
So how much of that and those decisions that these ancestors of yours made, how much of that was tied to their age at the time?
That's an excellent question. I love that. Edmund Pendleton was in his 50s around the time of, my second novel, 74 to 76, mid 50s. And Patrick Henry was about 15 years younger. So I talk about Edmund Pendleton being older and wiser. He had some gray hairs, and he realized that you don't just rush off to war without thinking about it. And, he was old enough to remember the fairly recent French and Indian War. And you lost loved ones, and that's no small thing. You don't just, and declaring our independence equals war, basically, back then. And so he knew that was not something that you just wanted to rush into. And he also realized that you needed to take time to be prepared. That's another way I can relate to Edmund Pendleton. I tend to over prepare at times and, love details. And he realized we needed foreign allies. We needed to have our supplies in order. And when you're younger, you tend to just say, no, we're just going to go beat them up. I have one scene in my book where Edmund Pendleton is training some of his relatives who wanted to study law. And by the way, Thomas Jefferson was jealous of Edmund Pendleton's library. So that tells you something about the respect that Edmund Pendleton had in Virginia. But I have one story, I call it homeschooling. Edmund Pendleton was a homeschooler, at least for, older students. And one of the guys, 15 years old, got up and said, hey, I just want to go fight. And he's like, you know what? We need to, there's a time and a place for that. But we need to take time to prepare and we need to make sure it's the right thing to do, because independence was not something to be taken lightly. And you need to decide, was it necessary? I mean, obviously, if you don't have to go to war, then it's probably not the thing to do. But if you need to, you need to be able to stand up and say, yeah, we need to go to war. And then again, the cost of war, and then are we ready? Interestingly, William Molineux was about the same age as Edmund Pendleton. I have one scene in my book. I mean, he was John Hancock's next door neighbor, and I have one scene in my book where John Hancock is telling William Molineux, at times I think that you're the one that's the youth. I'm the mature one. He was the life of the party kind of a person, and so he just loved having fun, and loved impacting people.
He sounds pretty brash. I don't know.
That's a good word for it.
The question would be, how was his home life? Did he take that to the home?
Well, he had children, and I don't make up people in my novels. There's a servant here and a messenger there. Although the slaves in my second book, I use the real names of the slaves for Washington, Patrick Henry, and Edmund Pendleton. And but yeah, his home life, as my understanding, was good. I found his wife's obituary, William Molineux's wife's obituary, and it talked about her being, and I can't remember the exact word, but basically a gentle soul. And William Molineux was not. But I believe his personality was such that he was very, very true to his family, and his family life was very, very important. But so was defending our rights. And William Molineux is not known today because he died 6 months before the war started, and it's still being debated today among historians as to whether or not it was murder or suicide. And the suicide theory is that he was paying more attention to politics than he was to his business. And that may have been true, but he was a showman. And in one of the town meetings, he stood up and he put his hand across his throat and he threatened suicide. But it was because the people weren't going along with what he wanted to do. He was a showman, and he was going to do whatever it took to get people to go along with what he felt like was the right thing to do. And the murder theory is that the British troops who set up in his front yard basically poisoned him. If you've been to Boston, Boston Common was basically his front yard, and that's where the British troops set up. And some people say, hey, he poisoned him. So it's not a murder mystery, but now that you know that there's some question about how he died, then you can kind of look for clues of that in my book as to which side you land on.
So how would you describe the genre of your books then?
Well, I love that question, because people ask me, is this historical fiction? And I'm like, when you spend 12 years writing these things and multiple research trips and so many, I have a whole new bookcase full of books because of the research. I don't like calling it fiction, but technically it falls into that category. I try to stick as close to the historical story as I can and not make things up, but you have to make up when did they say these things, or who were they talking to and what day and that kind of a thing. And as far as, so I refer to them, and you said this, and it's exactly what I say, historically accurate novels is how I like to say it.
It's interesting in the writing process when you're taking the historical facts and you're trying to put them into a genre that is entertaining and readable and lets the reader run through a story, get involved with the story as opposed to just a bullet point of facts on a page. It is much like, your workplace or your Sunday school or something. You got people who have same values and same objectives, but they're very different personalities, and you try to bring those personalities out. Sounds like you have done that. So
yeah, and I've tried. And as far as who would enjoy it, I wrote it originally thinking of politically conservative men. And then I would be in the foyer at church pitching to that demographic. And the wife, after I finished my pitch, would say, yeah, it sounds like something he wants to read. And I want to read it. I want my kids to read it. And I would say, wait a minute. I'm supposed to narrow my target market as opposed to make it broad. But I eventually learned it was not so much about age or gender as much about someone who loves our country and wants to learn more about our country or teach the next generation about our country. So homeschoolers love what they call living books. So even though I've written it on an adult level, not adult content. I mean, it's history. So there was the Boston Massacre and there was somebody that got drunk. And, I mean, I'm being true to history, but the writing style is considered an adult level, but 10, 11, 12-year-old homeschoolers are eating it up. So again, it's not about age or gender, but it's about love of country.
That's affirming, just as a creator and a writer. That's affirming that they're eating it up like that. How did you end up in Simpsonville at the old Hopkins farm at the Battle of the Great Canebrake? How did someone who writes about Virginia and Boston end up down in South Carolina?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, God has a sense of humor. My roots are very, very deep in the upstate of South Carolina. On one side of the family, on the other side is in North Carolina. So I'm a Carolina girl through and through, lived outside of these states just a few months of my life, and that was as a baby. And when I was doing the genealogy research, I felt like these people in my family tree, their stories needed to be told. And even though this one was in Boston, and I literally tried to disprove that he was in my family tree because it was a family tradition. And I had been doing family research and realized, oh, you graft people like that into your family tree. But then the research, when I tried to prove he was not in my tree, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Evidence kind of indicates that he was. And so, yeah, my roots are here in the Carolinas. But William Molineux took me to Boston and then Virginia. I mean, a lot of us that have been in this country for generations, a lot of us can trace back to Virginia. And then Philadelphia, because my ancestor, Edmund Pendleton, was a delegate to Continental Congress. And he actually was involved in training one of his cousins once removed in law. And that person ended up being a signer of the Declaration of Independence from North Carolina.
That's a pretty good pedigree right there.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like you're familiar with Andy Griffith, and Otis Campbell at one point was given a plaque because they found out that he descended from a Revolutionary War patriot. Are you familiar with this episode of Andy Griffith?
Isn't it interesting? I just find it interesting the amount of people in my life that quote Andy Griffith. So what an iconic show for our generation, I guess.
Yeah, but Otis, when he accepted the plaque, he said, "Well, darn, I can't take credit for just being born," and that's kind of how I feel. I mean, I'm very blessed to have this pedigree, but I'm like, I really can't take credit for being born. And James Madison is in my family tree, which I had no clue until I started doing my family tree research. He's like a third cousin. So it's crazy. It's crazy.
Well, it is crazy, but I often find myself envious of people like yourself that are able to do that. I tell people, listen, I go up my family tree, and I've got some great relatives and great ancestors, and but at the end of the day, it's kind of crooked. And I tell people I'm an American at the end of the day. And so what does it mean to be an American? And so having people buy into that American experience is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, not only here at Historyman, but I would imagine you too, trying to write these books that you're trying to get people to buy in to that, what it means to be an American. And we thank you for that. As we move through, though, we do come to this time where we ask our guests, what does freedom mean to you?
Well, and I don't know if I'm using this term technically correct. I did a little bit of research on it, but I felt like I could go in lots of different directions with this question. but what I kept coming back to was the fact that freedom to me means the right to self-govern. And I don't mean that there's not a place for laws, but maybe being autonomous is a way of saying it, a better way of saying it. And when the government starts telling us what we can and can't do inside our four walls, of our home, then I start getting concerned. And there were so many things, especially in Boston, that happened. And I had two readers after they read it, and this was several years back. And they said, I kept stopping and asking myself, is she talking about now or then? And so I was shocked at how much I read that I could relate to, and the rights that were being taken away. And it started, which I had no clue about this, but it started with a right to privacy court case. Some of the listeners may be familiar with James Otis, who was an attorney, and William Molineux was one of 63 men who were part of a court case that James Otis was the attorney for. And a young, I think 24, 25-year-old John Adams was sitting in the courtroom, and this was in the early 1760s. And he said, I think it was February 1761, John Adams said of that court case, he said it was on this day that independence was born. So we have no idea how far back it goes. My first editor, who edited like my first 30 pages way back at the beginning, when she read the first 30 pages, she said, I just thought they woke up one day and got mad in Boston and decided to go throw tea in the harbor. And I'm like, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But there were other rights that they were wanting to defend over the period of 15 years. There was the right to privacy, and that goes back to what do you do in your own home and that kind of a thing. And although it had to do with smugglers, so the patriots weren't always just the good guys, but there was kind of an understanding with Britain. It's like, what, the taxes are too high. We're just gonna kind of ignore what you're doing. But then they decided, hey, you know what? We're not going to ignore it any longer. But there was a standing army during time of peace. They passed a law where you were going to be required to house troops in your home. I mean, it was a little crazy. Right to assemble. One of the things that surprised me was the right to a jury by a trial by jury of your peers. And I believe, if I remember correctly, I think that's in the Declaration of Independence. I'm not positive, but I think it is. And I was I had to stop and think, wait a minute, where did that come from? And then I started to think, well, what would I be thinking if it was just one judge who was making the decision? So there's so many different things that freedom means to me, especially after studying for 12 years. I mean, my knowledge is very, specific, very narrow as far as the time and place. But taxation without representation was certainly there. But there was a whole lot more than just taxation without representation. I mean, there's a reason that we talk about we the people,
That's right.
And
that's right.
And that's significant.
Well, it's interesting too. We've taken civics out of the classroom. We've taken them out of the schools, and so, which is a terrible thing. It's terrible that we don't revisit these moments, and not only in the courtroom but in society. What were we fighting for? I tell people all the time, this was not a mob by any stretch of the imagination. They spent years deliberating, arguing, debating back and forth. What exactly unites them? What exactly are they upset about? Where does government draw the line with the private citizen? Where does the private citizen draw the line with the government? How did they set this up? And I talk about even the charge of the jury that William Henry Drayton made in 1774 to the grand juries in Camden and Sherall and Georgetown. He said, you set up this government based on these rights that you claim to have, these constitutional rights, and that government in turn set up these laws out of the parentage of those rights. You can't just walk away and pretend like it doesn't exist, or like that your job is done. You're a part of the community. You have to make sure that the law and the government act in the way that you set them up to act and still uphold your constitutional rights. Otherwise, and he would say, it would show a treasonable contempt of those constitutional rights out of which the laws arise. And we don't talk about that kind of stuff anymore. We just kind of wake up in the morning, go about our day, and we don't really think about what exactly we're doing. And so all of a sudden laws are passed and we feel like we don't have a say so, and we feel like it doesn't affect us. And it does. And we still have a responsibility to those things. And I wish civics would come back into the classroom. And
I want to emphasize that our responsibility to vote, I think I've missed 2 votes in my life. And one, I don't know if I was sick, and one I had a last minute out of town trip, and it had to do with writing. And so take your right to vote seriously, and study the candidates. Don't just go in and punch ballots. Right. That's right. Study the candidates. But another thought is, and I don't remember who said this, but we shouldn't fear the government. They should fear us.
That's exactly right. We derive our rights as human beings out of something bigger than the government. And we need to hold the government accountable for those things.
I'm hoping book number 3 will be about the Enlightenment, but we'll see.
I was going to ask you about that. What's your next book?
Well, there's another William Molineux, spelt with a Y instead of an I. Not related. DNA shows we're not related, but he was really good friends with John Locke.
Oh, now there you go. That's good. So where would we find these books?
Well, you can go on Amazon, or you can go to my website, which is cammolineux.com. That's CAMMOLINEUX, cammolineux.com. And I believe it's on the first page. You can scroll down and there's various options, for where you can go to find the books. And both books are in print as well as ebooks, and The Spirit of a Revolution is also in an audiobook. And The Spirit can make a great read aloud, especially for the purpose of discussion. But there's a lot going on in Boston, and so it's certainly something that would make a good read aloud.
Well, I want to read some things that people are saying about your books. One person says, I love history and thought I knew my early American history pretty well, but this book opened my eyes to several events and developments I had never heard of or long forgotten. And then another person said that Cam Molineux takes the reader on a journey that ends with a greater understanding of the earliest patriots and their struggles as the revolution drew closer. This historically accurate novel could be used as a family read aloud, or just for fun read, or a launching point to discover more. So I think those are some great encapsulating thoughts about your work. So good job.
Thank you. And on my website as well, with the 250th of so many different things coming up, you can also find a page that talks about how to party like it's 1776.
Well, so you do speaking engagements as well, right? How would people reach out to you on that?
Well, also on my website, there are the various topics that I speak on, including Patrick Henry and other things, Boston Tea Party, and you can contact me through my website.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for coming on board with us. We look forward to seeing you again at various events around the state as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States. And we know that, here in South Carolina, we know that the war was won here, but South Carolina has ties to all these places you write about. Certainly, we got on board united with the Boston struggle.
And I should mention this, since we're talking about South Carolina, Edmund Pendleton's nephew, Judge Henry Pendleton, is who the town of Pendleton is named after.
I was going to ask you, is this the same Pendleton family? And
Yes.
thank you for making that connection. Good job.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on board with us. And we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you again with your next book that you got coming out.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right.